Let's move on to something important. Anne Applebaum is a guest on my show tonight. Now, Anne is arguably the finest chronicler of Eastern Europe and Soviet crimes, well, in the entire English language, and I don't think that's hyperbole. And no sane or balanced person could advocate communism, surely, after reading her extraordinary book on the gulags and her new one about the Iron Curtain and Eastern Bloc. This country, this Canada, is populated with so many victims of socialism. Russia, Ukraine, the various Soviet republics, Poland and the other Eastern European nations raped by Moscow, China, Vietnam, and an assortment of African and Middle Eastern countries. One of the tragedies of our time, of any time really, is that the agonies of these various nationalities have not been commemorated in the way they deserve. We need to remember that the gulags, the torture, the genocide and the rapes started not with Stalin, but with Lenin, and from the very beginnings of communism, Soviet communism, founded on violence and death. In fact, any collectivist ideology has to include some sort of blood cult. Fascism was a pale imitation of communism. The idea that people are anonymous members of a group rather than precious individuals will always lead to tragedy. We need to remember the people of Ukraine who were starved, beaten, and murdered. Need to remember the Soviet guards standing outside enormous food centers watching as Ukrainian children died of hunger. Let us remember how the New York Times denied that this was even happening. The same New York Times that knew of the Holocaust and yet never gave it more than a token mention. Let us remember the Poles, their best and brightest, killed by Marxist communists from the East and National Socialists from the West. Let us remember that the gangster Stalin prevented Polish Battle of Britain pilot heroes marching in the London 1945 Victory Parade. So obsessed was he with snuffing out Polish identity. Let us remember ethnic Germans murdered and transported by the Soviets. Let us remember the millions killed in the new Marxist dawn of Cambodia, some of them simply because they were able to read and write or just wore glasses. Let us remember the Cultural Revolution in China with the blood running under the doors of the mass prisons, yes, and clever people in the West lauding China's communist leadership for their actions. Let us remember the terrified boat people of Vietnam fleeing firing squads and concentration camps. Let us remember all of those who died because of a twisted, ugly philosophy. For those I did not mention by name, forgive me, there are just so many to list. And let us also remember the useful idiots, the people in the West who let or encourage this to happen and who still enable similar horrors. The fools at the demonstrations, the selective outrage types who scream about America, Canada, Israel and the West, but say nothing about Iran, China, North Korea, Cuba. There is so much blood on their hands. The undereducated generally say at some point that more people have died in the name of religion than anything else. Oh, please, no. Far more people have died in the name of communism. Hundreds of millions of them, most in one single century. Dead because they weren't read. Shame, shame, shame. I'm quite angry with my next guest because she kept me up till about 4 a.m. I should qualify that straight away, reading her book, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. I've read a fair bit about this region and this era, but this is honestly the best single volume on this I've ever encountered. Anne Applebaum, author of Gulag, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and so much else. Golly, you're impressive.
Golly, thank you very much for saying so.
There's been a fair bit written about this, but I don't recall in one volume in English this area covered.
No, it's true. There's a lot written about this period, particularly in the languages of those countries.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do was put together my own research that others have done in the last couple of decades, and put it in one volume so that the whole story is told, and you can see not just what happened in Poland or what happened in Hungary, but you can see the patterns. You know, what was Soviet occupation? How did it work? How did they get all these countries to go along with it for this period of time? You know, what was the Stalinist system? It seemed to me that this was exactly the moment where you could see what is the institutional basis of it, what's the psychological basis of it, how does the ideology work? And that was the reason for this book.
Well, that's a wonderful first question, because you think of the Poles, for example, but not just the Poles, people who are so independent and so willing to give everything for their freedom, and yet the system pretty much worked. It controlled people. There were rebellions and revolutions, but it did control successfully for so long.
I mean, it was a polished technique. There was very careful use of targeted violence, not mass violence, so picking out people who might be leaders, people who might be kind of carry the national ideal. There's also a lot of concern for control of the mass media, of the radio. And also one of the things I didn't expect to find when I did this work is really right from the beginning, the Soviet Union and its communist local allies was obsessed with what we now call civil society, so self-organizing groups and the Boy Scouts and church groups, and making sure that they didn't exist, or if they did exist, they were under some kind of state-controlled umbrella. And that was really, that was one of the key pieces of the system, that they maintained control. It wasn't just political, it wasn't just economic, it was also control over civic life, cultural life.
Which is not dissimilar to National Socialism, because the Germans did have alternatives to every group, alternatives to the church, alternatives to the Scouts, alternatives to youth clubs, and gradually they submerged all of their rivals. Now, they didn't have as long, of course, as the Soviets had.
They didn't have as long, and there were other outlets in Nazi Germany where it was a little bit different. And there was some free enterprise, for example. It was not all state-dominated.
Of course, there were many people who they didn't have the energy, the courage, the capability to resist, but with other people who really did believe in the system. I remember going to East Germany, for example, and I was surprised, frankly, at how many people seemed to really believe in the system.
I mean, people did. It's very difficult when looking at this. There are different periods, right? So the period I'm talking about in this book and later period are different. But there were different elements of belief. I mean, so yes, some people believed. They also had very few choices, but not to believe. They also had incentives to believe. You know, if you believe, then you can progress in your career and so on. It's hard. You can't really separate in one person's brain the different strands of what that belief is made up with. But as I said, while writing this book, I became sympathetic to people who had to make these very hard choices about how to adjust and how to cope and how to live in that kind of system. And for some people, yes, it was convenient. It was not just convenient. It was positively advantageous, and it was a relief to believe, because then you were part of the system and you weren't in constant conflict.
How guilty is the West in, if not creating, allowing this to happen? You think of Polish resistance, Czech resistance to a certain extent, then what the Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, all collaborating, sometimes aggressively with the Nazis, but they're all handed over effectively to Soviet communism.
They were. Essentially what happens during the Yalta negotiations during the war is that this region is simply not a priority for either for the United States or Britain. It's not their main concern. Roosevelt at that time was very concerned about setting up the UN. Churchill's trying to get through the war without causing a fight between himself or anybody and the Russians and the Americans. So they're never focused on this region, and Stalin is. And Stalin is he knows where the borders are being drawn. He understands the ethnic distinctions between the different parts of the region, and he's concerned about maintaining control after the war. And then of course the war ends, and then we had a narrative about that. You know, victory has been declared, good has triumphed over evil, and we're going home. And it's never really been convenient for us to say, actually, that's not what happened, and that's not how the war ended. And we dismantled Hitler's camps, but Stalin's camps expanded after the war.
Yeah, and there was a consensus that Greece would be fought over, communism wouldn't go here, Turkey, Greece. But Eastern Europe, well, they're going to take it anyway, aren't they? It's sort of theirs anyway. It doesn't really belong to us. Do we really care?
There was something like that, and also just a lack of, just not our priority. We can't worry about that. Yes, there were moments. Eisenhower could have taken Prague. We could have tried to get to Berlin faster. I mean, there were things we could have done if we'd considered it our priority, but we didn't.
Now, the numbers, and you write about this in your other works, including Gulag, the numbers of people. I've never thought that Soviet communism was as inherently directly sadistic as Nazism. It wasn't genocidal, but anyone in the way, even suspected of being a problem, would be dealt with. The numbers of people in this period who were in camps, who were taken away, they may have survived, many died, whose families were just obliterated, but we're talking of millions of people here.
We're talking about millions of people. It's very hard to calculate, particularly in this time, what kinds of numbers you mean, because do you count the people who died during the Red Army's invasion? You know, do you count the people who their farms are collectivized, so they lose their main means of living, so they starve, and it's very hard. It's always been very hard to estimate numbers. But this particular period right after the war is very disruptive and chaotic. And if people don't die, there are other kinds of suffering and disorientation that do take place at this time.
Now, the word revisionism, we we generally assume is applied to Holocaust denial and so on. And anyone who denies the Holocaust is not a serious person, not taken seriously in civilized society. There are many people, though, who question this narrative. They would argue the Soviets, in fact, were doing the right thing. They benefited Eastern Europe. It became a safer place, a more stable place because of Moscow's rule.
There aren't that many people who argue that anymore, or at least I haven't heard anyone.
Have they?
I haven't heard that argument made in a long time. And there are people who want to argue that the West is somehow responsible for Stalinization, that we provoked the Cold War, and therefore, Stalin had no choice but to fight back. And actually, this book is designed precisely to undermine that narrative, because you can see when you read it that the Sovietization process, the communization process, whatever you want to call it, begins really the minute they arrive. And so there's before the Cold War, well before the alliance has started to fray, and there's a break between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that's really from the very beginning. It's their intention to create communist societies. They're not sure how long it's going to take. They don't exactly have a 10-point plan. They're going to try different methods, but they do intend to occupy this region from the beginning, and there's never really any question about it.
And militarily, you read accounts of Allied generals who saw the parade just after the end of the Second World War, the new tanks the Soviets were developing and so on, and then they were frightened, frankly. They didn't think if there was some sort of war, the West, we can't win it.
Well, people were tired of fighting. I mean, you asked about Poland a minute ago. People in Poland were tired of fighting. The war was long, and the World War II was a terrible war, very bloody, vicious, exhausting, draining, demoralizing. And people were not ready to fight again in 1945. They wanted to stop. They wanted to rebuild their lives. They wanted to go back and study. And there was not a lot of appetite for fighting anymore in that period.
Last question. Is this a comment on socialism or on Stalinism?
Stalinism. This is not an allegory. This is a book about that time and that place.
Okay. So there is still an argument, a compelling one perhaps, even a viable one for socialism. This was something entirely different.
I don't want to get into the argument of whether socialism is good or bad, but if you want to make the argument about for or against socialism, I would not use this period to make that argument.
All right, okay. Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe. Wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.